Hey everybody, David Tate here with Now Let's Be Honest for our final episode recap of The Chosen Season 3, so let's get to it, our recap of Season 3, Episode 8. The episode opens 1,000 years in the past, with King David and his wife Bathsheba being presented with a new psalm written by the chief musician Asaph. Asaph voices his desire that the psalm will comfort the people and please the king, and David voices his hope that it will also please the ultimate king up above. As Asaph begins to recite his psalm, David begins to tear up as Bathsheba looks down to cradle her pregnant belly. Back in Jesus' day, the Nabateans are continuing to argue with Jesus even as more groups approach, and Jesus tells his disciples to sit down even as Simon and John arrive. Jesus explains that they like to solve disagreements by talking. As he talks to them about faith, the apostles begin to ask him to increase their faith, but Jesus responds that it isn't about the size of faith, it's about who one's faith is in. In response to this, a man with a broken leg approaches Jesus seeking healing, and Jesus readily does so. At the sight of this, everyone readily sits down to listen to what Jesus has to say. Back in Capernaum, Eden is confronted by Zebedee, Salome, and Mary Magdalene. They ask her what's been going on between her and Simon, and it becomes evident very quickly that the discussion is one best suited for just the women. When Zebedee gets outside, he finds a shattered pot upon the ground, evidently thrown from atop the roof. Back in the house, Eden tells the women about her miscarriage. Her ritual cleansing hasn't helped her, and as much as she wants to talk to Jesus, he isn't around. They encourage her to go to the synagogue to hear the word of God. In the Decapolis, the powwow continues. Each group voices the issues that have arisen as a result of Andrew and Philip's ministry, but eventually the discussion devolves into a series of name-calling that shows that the people are really using Andrew and Philip's ministry as a scapegoat to set free their underlying animosity towards one another. When James and John stand up in anger at some of the comments, Jesus tells them now isn't the time for thunder, then turns to the crowds and begins to navigate the complex relationships. Eventually, Jesus begins to tell the parable of the sower, but since some people can't hear him, he has his apostles begin to organize them all into groups. On his way to Jerusalem, Nashon the healer encounters a shepherdess who warns him that a storm is coming. Back with the group, Jesus continues to share the parable of the sower, with his apostles repeating the words to their groups so they can hear. Amidst all of this, Simon is entirely checked out, not even acknowledging John when he tries to get his attention. After a super speedy journey to Jerusalem, Nashon arrives that night, but Shmuel is too distracted by his vest and lack of prayer tassels to hear his message. However, as soon as Nashon actually manages to relay his message, Shmuel immediately drops everything and makes preparations to travel to the Decapolis to see what Jesus is up to. In the Decapolis, Jesus speaks to an enraptured audience, and as the evening comes to a close, he invites all the weary and heavy-laden to come to him and find rest. He tells everyone to rest and they will continue in the morning. Matthew, Judas, and Thomas calculate that there are 2,000 people and counting present already. Philip and Andrew voice that the Gentiles are running out of food, but Simon says it isn't their problem. As people grow irritated with Simon's attitude, John tries to calm them down, telling them that Jesus said the mission depended on Simon. Simon's still irresponsive, caring for no one but himself as he walks away from them. When Andrew tries to comfort him, he simply says Jesus is going to do what he's going to do no matter what they do. The following day, Shmuel, Yanni, and their friend Ozem make their way to the Decapolis. Ozem doesn't know why they're meddling in the Decapolis when it's the holy city that matters. There's more syncretism and Hellenism in the Decapolis for them to hope to address in any meaningful way. He encourages them to all relax. This day, Jesus shares another story about two sons, one obedient and the other disobedient. He also shares parables about the kingdom of heaven, but is interrupted by little James, who points out that they have an issue. The people are hungry, and they don't have enough resources to provide. Fortunately, Andrew brings forth 5 barley loaves and 2 fish given by Telemachus. John mentions that this whole ordeal is embarrassing, but Simon says Jesus will take care of it if he wants to. When John notices that Simon looks scared, Simon admits that he's afraid Jesus will choose them. Jesus prays over the food, then places it in the basket and tells his disciples to feed them. The disciples are all confused, but Thomas, recalling the wedding at Cana, says it feels familiar. As they gather 12 baskets, Jesus shares another parable, this one comparing the kingdom of heaven to a mustard seed that multiplies greatly. When the apostles go to open their baskets, they find them filled with food. All begin to praise God, except for Simon, who simply looks annoyed. Jesus tells the crowds that he's given them plenty of spiritual food, so now he wants to give them physical food to eat, and the disciples begin to hand it out to the people. Eden and her mother go to visit Yusuf, who counsels her by reminding her that Simon is caught in the middle of the world being upended by Jesus' ministry. Eden admits that she is angry with Simon, and Yusuf advises her to bathe in the mikveh now that the cistern is up and running, which he tells her Simon is responsible for having helped fix. Eden's mother requests that Yusuf read some joyful scripture to her, but he says that wouldn't be helpful. Instead, he opts to read her a psalm of Asaph, the very one we heard at the beginning of the episode. He tells her that Simon, like the psalmist, is probably desperate and angry, and advises her to pray the psalm with and for Simon. He reads her the psalm, which begins in anguish, yet commits to meditating upon Yahweh's mighty deeds and holy ways. As he reads, Eden is visibly shaken. Meanwhile, Simon is absent-mindedly going through the motions of serving the people, still distracted by his own frustrations. By the end of the meal, there are 12 baskets still left over, and Matthew is happy to pronounce that he's no longer surprised by these sorts of things. Meanwhile, Simon throws his basket on the ground and storms off. The Pharisees arrive at the Decapolis just as the crowds are departing, and they happen to run into and talk to the very same people who were prominent in the discussions earlier. When they're informed that Jesus multiplied the fish, Ozem is most surprised that he broke bread with Gentiles. Finally, they've captured his attention. Meanwhile, Atticus watches from a distance. Leander tells them about Jesus' teaching, which Ozem pronounces as blasphemy. Leander says that their people have been hurting one another, but Jesus is healing them. Ozem spits on Leander's feet, and suddenly Shmuel seems shaken up. Something isn't sitting right with him. Simon rents a boat as a storm rolls in. The rest are wondering how they're going to beat the storm, but Simon says they'll row across and beat it that way. Jesus says he needs some alone time to pray, but tells them to follow Simon. Simon tells John that he thinks he was a mistake. Even God makes them, right? As the dusk sets in, Shmuel walks around in deep thought until he finds himself face to face with Jesus, who invites him to pray with him at the top of the hill. Shmuel says he feels like David, with his enemies being exalted over him, and Jesus says he knows what it's like to lose something. Shmuel asks him what he's losing, and Jesus says, time. He invites Shmuel to pray with him and says he will gladly speak with him afterward. Shmuel accepts the invitation. Out on the sea, the storm has gotten really, really bad. The apostles row with all they've got but aren't making any progress. Simon stubbornly presses on, and Atticus watches from a distance, but first John and then the others see a ghostly figure walking towards them across the water. Simon tells them to stop rowing as he realizes what they all begin to realize. It's Jesus. He tells Jesus to call him out on the water if he really is who he claims to be, and Jesus calls him out. As Simon steps out on the water, Eden steps into the mikveh. Simon yells his concerns at Jesus, voicing his frustration that Jesus would serve everyone seemingly besides him. Meanwhile, Eden and the women pray to God. Jesus explains to Simon that he allows trials to help strengthen their faith, and that's why he's allowing Simon and Eden to go through this. Eden lowers into the mikveh, and as she sinks deeper into it, Simon takes his eyes off Jesus and looks at the waves, causing him to sink into the water. He cries out, "Lord, save me!" And Jesus lifts Simon from the water, pulling him into his arms and rebuking him for his lack of faith. Simon holds himself close to Jesus, who tells him that he has a lot planned for Simon, including hard things. Once they get back into the boat, Simon begs Jesus not to let him go. Jesus calls for the storm to be still, and the storm obeys, the wind and the waves growing calm all around them. Simon keeps repeating, "Don't let me go," even as Eden prays, "Don't let him go." A little while later, we hear Asaph continuing to recite his psalm as Matthew weeps as he holds his prayer tassels. John the Baptist is praying in prison. Gaius is tending to his ill son. Ramah is writing into a scroll, and Thomas is staring out into the nighttime sky, looking at the moon. And Simon, at long last, reunites with Eden and embraces her. We cut back to 1,000 years earlier, where David and Bathsheba continue to be moved by Asaph's song. Once the song comes to an end, David takes his wife's hand and tells Asaph that he thinks the psalm is ready, and the scene cuts to black. The end of season 3. So like I said with the previous episode, I really did enjoy this episode, and I'm really glad that they decided to include the walking on water scene, because it was going to be a really big pet peeve of mine if they didn't include it, because I know whenever Dallas first mentioned that, I understood why he was saying he didn't want to include the walking on water scene, but the fact that it is mentioned in the opening theme song, to me, it's like, it'd just be really weird for them to not include that. And so I'm really glad they did that. And I think that they pulled it off in a way that was narratively compelling. And it really did kind of partially satisfy the character arc that they've had Simon Peter going on. I know his name's not Peter yet in the show, but the character arc that they've had Simon going on in this season, I think that there was a nice partial resolution to it. And I keep saying partial resolution because I feel like while the therapy session they had out on the water was kind of nice, I feel like there's still some underlying issues that need to be addressed between Jesus and Simon, and I hope that they don't just leave it where it was at the end of season 3. I hope that they do at least address some stuff at the beginning of season 4, if not later on, because there's still some stuff that really Simon needs to come to understand, because how he was responding, basically what I'm saying is if that walking on water scene is the only resolution we get, I don't know if it's entirely satisfying, and I don't know if it is the full resolution that was demanded by all the things that preceded it. And so I'm expecting that we'll hopefully see a little bit more there. But I really like that they did the walking on water scene, and I think that they pulled it off really, really well. As for the other stuff in the episode, I think that it was pulled off well. When it comes to how they're adapting scriptural moments here, I will say that I think this is one of the weaker episodes. Don't get me wrong, I still think it is the best form of Christian entertainment that we'd have received pretty much ever, because I think they're doing a fantastic job with what they're doing. But something about it did feel a little bit off and almost lackluster to me. I don't really know how to articulate that very well, but I still think that they did a good job with what they had, and it was still really cool to see all the extras there doing all that. Also, just to backtrack a little bit more, something about the whole powwow they had earlier on in the episode between all the different ethnic groups and stuff, something about that felt a little bit off to me as well. And I think I even felt that way whenever I first watched the episode, because something about it just felt kind of weird to me, and I'm not totally sure what they were trying to communicate there, and I'm not totally sure what the narrative thrust of it was, other than just to explore different cultures and to kind of set up the feeding of the 5,000 thing. And I think that's one thing that I've kind of struggled with this season as a whole, is that there's a lot of plot points that I'm not totally sure if I see where they're going, and maybe they're just laying the groundworks for future seasons. But to me, from a narrative perspective, each season has to at least have a satisfying beginning and end, if that makes sense. And while it does make sense to lay the groundwork for future seasons, something about a lot of the plot points that they established in this season really felt like a connective tissue, or like a link between two seasons, to where seasons 1 and 2 felt like good individual seasons in and of themselves that were part of a greater whole, whereas season 3, a lot of the plot points felt like they were just almost like trying to weave together stuff that they've established in seasons 1 and 2 to stuff that's going to be paid off in seasons 4, 5, 6, and 7. And so season 3 felt kind of odd to me, and a lot of the plot points that we saw here just felt almost kind of out of place, to where I was kind of confused as to what the ultimate goal was in them, to where, if anything, some of the plots almost felt like filler. And I'm not saying that to be overly critical. I'm just trying to voice my thoughts as somebody who is, like, this is what I'm thinking whenever I'm watching the episode. And y'all might totally disagree with me, and that is totally fine, and I'm sure y'all will let me know in the comments, and I'm totally fine with that. If this hasn't been bothering you, that's great. But for me, something about it, whenever I've been watching these episodes, there's been so many moments where I'm just sitting there being like, what is the ultimate purpose of this? I guess that some of it's just trying to help build the world and help us understand the culture of that time period. But from a personal perspective, a lot of the stuff is just world building for the sake of world building and helping us understand that culture just for the sake of helping us understand that culture. Whereas I am more concerned with the overall story they are trying to tell, which doesn't mean that it has to be something strictly focused on the biblical stuff. I just want to know how the different scenes we're seeing contribute to the overall story they're trying to tell in the Chosen universe. But that just takes patience, and I'm assuming that it'll be answered in future seasons. To me, just season 3 itself felt kind of like it didn't have an overall voice in what it was trying to contribute to the show as a whole. It felt like a connective tissue. For instance, I really, really, really did like the stuff with Shmuel in this season, even though it was very few and far between, because you can see how it's advancing the conflict between the Pharisees and Jesus, and is building up to a head. So you can see that even though it's not fulfilled in this season, it's heading somewhere. And there's other plots like that, even with the Eden and Simon thing. I really did like that, because you could feel that it was building towards a head, and you could see that they had something specific in mind that they were trying to communicate through that plot line. There's other plot lines where it's just kind of been lingering there, and I get that they're probably heading somewhere with it in the long run, but just in this season, it really felt like filler, and that was what I was really, really struggling with, because I'm all about being patient and waiting for the story to be told. But I do believe that if we were talking about any other TV show that was outside of the Christian entertainment industry, or something as amazing as The Chosen, we would be kind of confused when they do have certain plot points that are there throughout the entire season, but don't have any sort of payoff. And I would raise this type of criticism for anything. If I was watching one of the Marvel movies, I think that yes, the Marvel movies can have something that tie together with the other movies, but the movie in and of itself has to stand on its own. If I'm reading a Harry Potter book, the books should tie into one another and contribute to the overarching story, but each book needs to stand on its own. I think that's what I was struggling with a little bit with The Chosen Season 3, because it seems like it was focused so much on setting stuff up for the future that the season itself didn't seem to really stand on its own. I'm not trying to be nitpicky on the show in particular. This is just something that I would say if I was talking about any TV show. I think that another one of my biggest concerns is that it still feels like we're still really early on in Jesus' ministry, despite the fact that we're 3 seasons in, and Dallas has already said that season 5 is going to be covering Holy Week, and season 6 is going to be covering the crucifixion and stuff like that. And I just don't really see how we're going to get from where we are now to the end of Jesus' ministry in just the span of season 4. I think that's one of the big things that's confusing me, because it feels like we should be a lot further along in Jesus' ministry, whereas right now we're just at the very initial popularity, which just kind of confuses me a little bit from a narrative perspective. I'm sure that they'll be able to answer all my concerns over the course of the next season. It's just something that kind of confuses me and baffles me right now, because it feels like we're still very early on in his ministry, and maybe that's just how I'm reading it, but let me know what you think about that in the comments. And like I said, people are probably going to think I'm being hypercritical, and there's other people who are probably going to think I'm being undercritical. I still enjoy the show. I'm not trying to suggest in any way that I don't enjoy the show. I'm just trying to be honest with my thoughts and my opinions. That being said, I've probably talked enough here on the back half of this video. Let me know what you thought about this episode. Let me know if there's anything super important that I missed in my recap. And until next time, I will see y'all later. My name is David Tate. This is Now Let's Be Honest. Be sure to keep a smile on your face and don't let anybody steal your joy. I will see y'all later.